right, I'm really excited about this next panel because it's a space that I spend a lot of time working in. The title is Creating Blockbusters, the Role of Games and Interactivity in Developing Entertainment Franchises. And we have a blockbuster panel for sure. Our moderator today is Chris Heatherly, who's former EVP, Games and Digital Platforms at NBC Universal, also spent time at Disney. And Chris, welcome to the panel.
Ned, thank you. You'll see I'm wearing a collared shirt just for you. I don't wear collared shirts for everyone.
Chris. Thank you.
That's the respect and love I have for you. So if everyone could come on video and audio, and we'll start to introduce the panel. This panel is so all-star that Epic had to open for us. That's how all-star the panel is. So I'm going to go left to right as I see you on your screen. So so I have first Jeremy Padower. Can you introduce yourself?
Hey, Jeremy Padower. I'm a partner at Jazzwares, and we are one of the largest toy companies in the world, and we are really, really well situated in the gaming space. Very exciting to be here.
Awesome. Jeff Gomez.
Hey, Jeff Gomez here, CEO of Starlight Runner Entertainment. We're a New York-based production company that specializes in multi-platform narrative, transmedia storytelling.
Morgan Alexis Kruger.
Hi, Morgan Kruger. I'm the COO of MWM Universe. We seek to build and partner with modern direct-to-consumer franchises to build them across platforms.
Lydia Bottegoni.
Hi, Chris. So I am the SVP of Story Franchise Development at Blizzard Entertainment, which basically means I oversee the team that builds out the franchise world outside of the game.
Awesome. And then my good friend, Daniel Engelhardt.
Hi, I'm Daniel. I oversee the games business at Lionsgate. So we've made some investments in the game space, and we're also very focused on adapting our franchises into games. Sometimes integrating our properties into existing games, like we put Wick into Fortnite last year, which is super fun. And then also some original games as well. John Wick strategy game and a bunch of other fun stuff that we'll get to talk about.
Awesome. Well, it's an honor to have you all on. This is an all-star panel. Just for the audience, if you have any questions, please put those in the Q&A as opposed to the chat, because the Q&A is what I'll be looking at. And if you want to razz Jeremy Padower, the chat is the place for that. So I'm going to open up and start with The Godfather. So this is a panel on how to make games into blockbuster franchises, which I take to mean, building games into more than game, building them into universes, movies, comic books, books, consumer products, all types of things. So, Jeff, you are the godfather of transmedia entertainment, which is really about telling stories across multiple platforms and multiple forms of media. You have decades of experience in this space. Can you talk about how you see transmedia storytelling today and how it fits in with the game space?
Sure thing, Chris. Well, it's really kind of coming into its own, isn't it? Transmedia storytelling was something that was kind of an obscure term. It was kind of a nerd term for narratives that play out across different media in concert, right? So it's not repeating the same story from platform to platform. You get pieces of the story and kind of assemble them for yourself. When it works, it's wonderful. We started seeing experiments with it with projects like The Matrix, where the video game actually told a complementary story to the story in the movies. And of course, now we're seeing transmedia universes unfold across different media with Star Wars or the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Transmedia is rooted in great story world development, story worlds that can be readily expressed and extended across these media, not just in gaming. So we're seeing more of this in recent years. for years, game concepts were born out of new gameplay elements, improved graphic capabilities, deeper interactive features. But now that so much of that has been mastered, some game developers are turning their attention to more compelling narratives, stronger reasons for players to become emotionally committed, like in The Last of Us, which is one of my favorite games. Richer story worlds allude to the past and the future. They give you the sense that more is going on than meets the eye. Halo, which Starlight Runner worked on, is a great example. When we started work with Microsoft Game Studios, there was only a tiny minority of players who really cared about the backstory, the lore, or the origin of the Master Chief character. When you look at the entire history of the Halo universe, aspects that Bungie might have just jotted down on paper napkins, those weren't dramatized in the original games. But there was an amazing universe there, a cosmology, a philosophy. John 1:17, what's with him? You know, he was a deep person. And we realized that Master Chief's life story was kind of a microcosm of the messages and themes of the totality of the Halo universe. So when you can distill this essence and humanize those core characters, you have what it takes to make an incredible story world that can be extensible across different media. And the Halo TV series is a case in point. Spielberg's Amblin Pictures is doing the Showtime series, and it's really, from what I understand, shaping up to be great evidence of this development process.
So I'm going to turn to Lydia. You have a very interesting role at Blizzard because Blizzard has these really beloved IPs. I mean, I've always thought of Blizzard as sort of the Pixar of the game space. It's known for that level of game quality, but it has these IPs like Warcraft and Diablo, StarCraft that go back decades. And you are take a game like Diablo, working on the next, generation of that game. So you have creators who own sort of the future of the franchise. You own storytelling outside of the game. So how does that process of co-creation work?
Yeah, it's funny, when I asked that question, I've said before, it's sort of like sprinting on ice. It's really fun and exhilarating, but it's also potentially super dangerous, and you can get hurt. There's really not one answer. And just also something I'll clarify, we also, the team that I represent, we also participate in in-game storytelling as well. So in-game cutscenes, the real-time cutscenes, cinematics in-game are also part of the work that the team I represent does. So we have this really interesting mix of some external content, some support content, sometimes marketing content like game capture trailers, cinematics, and in-game content. So it's sort of all over the map. And I think that's what makes it fun. And you're right, a game like Overwatch is in a very different place in its timeline and in its lifespan than a game like World of Warcraft. And so what you have to be mindful of is different. Also, the personalities of each of those teams are pretty different. The creative talent that leads the charge on each of those games, they're human beings, they're all different, they all have different personalities. Some of them have been at the company a long time, some of them have come from other game studios. And so really trying to figure out what the right collaboration looks like and how to best support them. I mean, at the end of the day, my team is there to support game development. That's what we do. If it's anything from, again, an RTC in Diablo to a game trailer for a new feature for Heroes of the Storm, all of that is in service of and supporting game development. We sort of show up however the game teams need us. So the answer is really, it depends on what the need of the game is. It may be something as subtle as lore editing or lore management for a script that's being written not by my team, but we're just kind of spot checking it for lore and making sure we're not violating canon. It can be something as subtle as that, all the way to owning and operating the story room for the narrative for the actual game. and kind of everything in between. It really just depends on what the game team needs and how we can help them, how we can help them out. It's not one size fits all. Is the answer.
Awesome. So Daniel, you kind of come from the opposite direction, which is that you work at a movie and TV studio, like I have a lot, and you have filmmakers who own the vision for a lot of your IPs. But one of the things I've always been impressed by, and that I think you were always able to pull off a little bit better than I was, which is you've done a great job of courting these indie developers who have their own voice, and then figuring out how to give them a fair amount of creative freedom to translate these IPs into the game space. Talk about how that collaboration works, how you work with filmmakers, and how you get that freedom.
Yeah, well, so we're lucky in that we have a big library to play with. So like just as an example, like last year, we released Blair Witch, a horror game with Bloober Team, great indie dev in the horror space. As I mentioned, a John Wick strategy game with Mike Bithell. We did a Power Rangers game, fighting game on PC and console. And then also, which is not our IP, by the way, that was, we partnered with Hasbro for that. And then also brought Five Nights at Freddy's, big game franchise, into VR, not our property as well. So all of these games, and properties can be more different in terms of, the sort of audience and, creative opportunities around them. And so what we've done is we scour the globe to find the best developers that we can find who are passionate and have a unique vision for each specific franchise that we're looking to adapt into a game or extend further into games. And in that process, part of it's finding a really great creative team that has a unique vision, but it's also giving them as much insight into the underlying property as we can. So as an example, in the case of John Wick, Mike Bithell, who directed John Wick Hex, was sitting down with Chad, the director of John Wick, once a quarter, let's say. He did stunt and weapons training with the same people who train Keanu and Halle. And we really gave him an inside look, Mike Bithell, that is, into what makes John Wick from the perspective of the people who created, John Wick initially. And in doing that, it gives us an opportunity to give him a lot of freedom, because we can trust then that he knows how to make an awesome game. And we know that the decisions he's going to make are going to be informed by not just someone who's a fan of the property, because of course he's a fan, but someone who really understands the DNA of the property and the sort of creative thinking that went into creating it to begin with. And that's sort of what we essentially aim to do, is how do we give our developers as much, partner with the right teams and give them as much freedom as we can. So because we know that making a movie and making a game is two very different beasts. And if we, shackle our game developers with the same restrictions that we might put on, if we were making a film adaptation of a property, we're not going to end up with a fun game. And so it's really been about building close collaborations between the creative teams behind our franchises and partnering them with really talented game developers who have their own vision, and finding a way to make sure that as we're adapting the property into games, we're really coming at it from an understanding of what made the property work in the movie space, so that we can be smart about the decisions we need to make in adapting it.
And you found that the filmmakers are willing to accept that premise up front, that, hey, I need to give these guys creative freedom to do what they do?
Well, it depends on the property. So in the some filmmakers and some properties we can be more flexible with and be really open in the creative process. There's other properties that have more restrictions. I think from our perspective, the way we've approached it is we're really upfront with the developers that we're speaking with about what the rules of the road will be. In the case of Blair Witch, as an example, we were able to give Bloober a lot of freedom so they for those who don't know, their background is making awesome psychological horror games, and they tell really great stories in their games. So when we initially started talking to them about Blair Witch, it was really interesting because they know how to tell a great story. So we were able to just say to them, hey, do what you normally do, but set it in the Black Hills Forest and take advantage of all the things that make Blair Witch. But because it wasn't a property where we had, sequels coming and we were able to give them a lot of freedom. We didn't have to worry about tripping up, certain issues that might be happening on the movie or TV side. In the case of Wick, we had to be much more careful, right? Because we were making the game at the same time that John Wick 3 was being made. But again, that came down to making some smart creative decisions that allowed us to give our developer the freedom that we did. So as an example, in the case of Hex, we set that pre-John's impossible task and before he met Helen. And we sort of set it before all that in an undisclosed time that it wasn't clear where it was in the timeline. And so all the things that happened in the game didn't have a material impact on canon or anything that might be happening in John Wick 3 or any of the additional movies that we're going to be making. And so that allowed, by engineering it that way in the beginning, it allowed us to give Mike more freedom as he thought about all the things that he wanted to do to make that game fun without having to be overly concerned about some of the story elements that could create complications.
Yep. So Morgan, I want to turn to you. You come at things from from kind of a third or fourth way of doing it, which is that you often look at things like a podcast or an artist where you've got a raw talent or a seed of an idea, and then you look at how to develop those into a 360 franchise. Can you talk about that process a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. And I want to echo a lot of what Daniel said about sort of setting up the rules of the road to make something authentic. One thing I want to sort of say at the outset is when we develop, we sort of come at it from a franchise and community perspective. We're trying to build franchises and own the community that engages in that story world. And we actually have an interactive division at our company, MWMI Interactive. It's an independent publisher. And they partner with the most compelling developers. And so we have a real leg up when we're thinking about taking something, that starts in one medium and is moving across other mediums. It'll be moving into the gaming space. We're able to partner really effectively and strongly with our interactive team in doing that. And we've had a couple of those conversations and are moving down those paths as we go. Again, we come at it from the kind of franchise and community angle. And at the very beginning of the process, I think a lot about, and our team thinks a lot about, what is endemic to this franchise and story world? What are the things that the people who love this story world love about it? And what are the ways that they engage in it? And consumer behavior is a lot about the medium it's presented in. The way that you engage with a podcast is very different than the way that you engage with a published book with words on the page versus even a comic book versus a game versus a television show. And so moving from any one point on that spectrum to another point requires being really thoughtful about what are we keeping the same and what are we changing as we move this story world from one place to another. And again, Daniel was talking a lot about sort of setting up the rules of the road and making it really clear, here are the things you can play with, and then here are the things, both from a story world and sort of a consumer behavior perspective, and here are the things that are kind of untouchable, that we need to kind of keep sacrosanct and keep the same. And that process allows you to work with the experts in each of the individual mediums to create something that feels really authentic and endemic to that medium, but still part of the larger franchise and story world as a whole. So it's a very iterative process. I wish I could say it's always A to B, but it's about being thoughtful about the story world and what people love about it, and the medium that you're moving from and to, and what is endemic to the consumer behavior in that instance.
Yeah, I mean, it's always best when it's an iterative process because that means it's a collaborative process, right?
Right.
So, Mr. Jeremy Padawer, you and I have worked together for many, many years, and you have a background at Mattel where you've overseen some of the biggest, and Jack Pacific where you've overseen some of the biggest toy IP brands in the world. You and I work together on studio IP, but largely the Disney stuff, Disney Princess, Disney Fairies,
Club Penguin.
Other ones. Club Penguin was, I think, your first video game IP, right? I broke you into the game space. So Jazzwares was the company that you sold your company Wicked Cool to. Between Wicked Cool and Jazzwares, you produced toys for Pokemon, Halo, Minecraft, Roblox, Ninja, and other game influencers. How did you become the go-to games toy guy? And how is that different from your experience with some of these more established studio IPs?
Well, okay. So how do you become the go-to? Well, I think the first thing to note is that you can't fish in the same pond as Mattel and Hasbro when you're starting a toy company. And the reality is that there were so many organizations trying to go after the next Disney opportunity, or Universal, or Warner, or Nickelodeon, that when it came to looking for the next thing, we didn't swim with the same fish. We looked for a new medium. And so whether it was Pokemon, Roblox, Minecraft, you name it, Halo originally, these are companies that were independent. And we became experts at bringing digital to physical toy product through themes and relevant play patterns. But you start where you can be competitive. And it just so happens to be now that the gaming space is one of the largest spaces in the entire toy industry. So it evolved. It didn't start that way, but it evolved to that. And I believe the second part of the question was, how is it different, right, from dealing with a traditional IP holder? And what I would say is it varies. I would say that when you're talking about a traditional IP holder, you might be talking about an organization that's been managing brands for decades and decades, if not, 100 years. In these cases, some of these stakeholders are just developing the way they engage with their licensing partners. So it can be as complex as you're helping develop their entire internal systems, or it can be a scenario where you're, kind of collaborating hand in hand in an enhanced way that you wouldn't otherwise be. But it certainly has come into its own.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it's a blessing not to be tied to those legacy studio models of IP collaboration with toy makers. And some of those models still work, and some of them are outdated. And it's great to be able to start from scratch and help some of these folks build their processes for today.
Yes, I mean, look, necessity is the mother of invention. Right? And in the case of licensing, or in the case of any new category, I would always recommend entrepreneurs not to try to compete with billion-dollar companies. And then perhaps maybe you'll get there yourself one day, because a new category, a new area opens up and shows itself to be so significant. And like I said, I think this space today is so obvious to attach toys or collectibles against, but certainly it hasn't been historically.
Yeah. So I'm going to go to a couple of the questions that we've gotten in the Q&A, and I encourage folks to send us more. So the first one I have is from Michael Holton, who says, how do you decide which transmedia vehicles work for a particular story world and which ones don't? So who wants to take that?
I can give it a shot.
I knew you would.
To a certain degree, a great story world ought to be iterative into all kinds of different media. But the advice that Starlight Runner usually gives is, well, what medium is at hand? What is your company focusing on? If you have a specific set of media that you have direct access to, and for some people in the audience, it might be, well, social media or the web or things like that, then you will tell the story out of the story world that plays into the strongest features of that medium. So some of you may launch with a comic book because there's a fantastic visual component, or a novel. Those two things are relatively inexpensive compared to video games and movies, but they're great launch points for your intellectual property, and they can easily fall into the hands of Hollywood. Podcasting, same thing. Audio dramas are now amongst the strongest sources for transmedia extension of them all. So what do you have at hand? And then what aspect of the story world is going to be playing strongest to it?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that one a little bit too. One of the things that we think about also at Blizzard, those same lines, is who is the player base that you're trying to speak to in that? Because we found there are some of our players that really care about lore and care about character backstories and bios and that sort of thing, and then others that don't. And so one of the things we also look at if we're talking about something like, like a comic or a novel or an audio drama, is what segment of our player base does that speak to, and is that a segment that we haven't been feeding regularly? So also sometimes just who are you trying to reach? Because those different vehicles play definitely to different segments of your community.
Agreed.
Yeah, there's definitely the risk that you can become too lore heavy, which so I want to I have an interesting question here that's come up, and I don't know how quite to tackle it, which is I'm going to take the first part of it. How do you make sure that when you're building a story world and you have a passionate fan base that is going to change over time, and they're giving feedback in real time on how they feel about things, especially when you have a beloved IP, sort of how do you think about the audience? The funny part of this question is that it gets into Last Jedi and the problems between Last Jedi and the final film of the series. Not a problem. I have thoughts on it I could share, but probably a whole panel unto itself. But I want to kind of throw this question a little bit to Morgan, because Morgan, you have a very kind of community-oriented approach, and you talked about the value of audience. How do you think about the feedback that you get from the audience? Because it can be confusing, contradictory. There's always a danger of too much fan service. Sort of, how do you think about that?
Right. It's always sort of dangerous to talk about anything in relation to Star Wars in any kind of a public forum. So be kind. But I'll tackle it. One thing that I think about is the consumer expectations with that fan base. I think something like Star Wars has a particular set of challenges associated with it, because that franchise was in many ways kind of encased in amber for 30 years. And so people didn't see that as a pliable or malleable world for them to play in. They saw it as these are very specific rules, and they emerge in very specific, they show themselves in very specific ways. And that's my relationship with that franchise, or each of the consumers' relationship with that franchise. We, for good and for ill sometimes, but in this case for good, we are oftentimes starting with younger franchises where the rules of the road have emerged more recently via social media, where there is a bit more of a push-pull and pliability in the relationship between the creator and their audience. And so the sort of expectations and norms have already been kind of established as a bit more of a back and forth. And so, in some ways we don't necessarily have that problem, but then you have a new set of problems of what are those norms? What are those rules of the road? And it really depends on the creator and on the story world. And also on, what your means of sort of rolling content out and how your content engine works. Some creators, again, for good or for ill, have more of an attitude of, this is my story world, and if you don't like it, tough. This is the thing that I feel. And you can either buy in or not to this really authentic, clear vision that I have for what it is. Whereas other creators feel they enjoy that push and pull a bit more. They want the, this is something that I'm building with you. And we're gonna, not entirely, not everybody's in the writer's room, but I'll listen. Sometimes I'll say no. Sometimes if you sort of accepted as if you gave the fans everything they wanted all the time, then it would be this. It would be more of a. It could be reduced to a bit more of a bland soup.
Yep.
So you need to withhold some things sometimes, and that push and pull. It's a relationship, and so there's no one way that a relationship can evolve. But there is that back and forth. Jeff.
Chris, I'm going to be kind of blunt here. Disney told the customer to screw off with the response to Last Jedi. And you don't tell the customer that they're not right. They need to have known that the product that was going to sequelize a beloved fan base had some subversive components to it, and enter into a dialogue, as Morgan said, with the fan base before the movie came out, to in effect sort of prepare them for what was going to happen, and to make sure that dialogue was going to arc through the rollout, the release, and the aftermath of the movie. Instead, when there was this tiny minority of fans that pushed back and said, this is, they don't like this, it's subverting Star Wars, they said, they attacked the fans. They dismissed them and then attacked them. The celebrities who starred in the movie said bad things about the fans. So this inflamed a kind of civil war within the fandom, which was not healthy for Star Wars, and wound up being injurious to the licensing and merchandising of the franchise, and took the Mandalorian to kind of start healing. We all need to engage our fan base in dialogue. The two styles that Morgan outlined are both fantastic, but both do require a listening and validating and celebrating the participation of the fans.
Yeah, I think go ahead.
I'll also add that it's hard to set up sort of a continuous dialogue ecosystem when one of the main methods of communication is multi-$100-million movies released annually or semi-annually. It's a tough system that way.
Yeah, I was going to say it's interesting in the context of making a game, particularly if a game is a service. You have an opportunity to engage with your community in pretty unique ways and make changes and update things as you see feedback. And we've actually had quite a bit of success doing that with our Power Rangers games. When we first launched our Power Rangers mobile game, Power Rangers Legacy Wars, which just celebrated its 3-year anniversary, it was a super unique opportunity for us and Saban at the time to give something to fans that they hadn't had before, which is Saban gave us the right to do touch every single season of Power Rangers. So it was a fighting game on mobile that became essentially like the all-star cast of every cool Power Ranger. And if you were a Power Rangers fan, it was essentially unlocking the keys to the kingdom to be able to interact with every major character that you love. And in doing that, it was amazing. The community response was incredible. We did a good job early on engaging with the community and bringing some of the super fans into the office to see early builds of the game and give us some feedback and giving them sort of some sense of ownership over the game. And as it's evolved, we've really listened to the community. And when we release new characters into the game, a lot of that's based off of feedback that we've seen from previous character releases and which ones they're responding most to. And I think a good example of us also pivoting in a pretty big way is we did a crossover event where we brought Street Fighter into the Power Rangers mobile game, which is super fun. To get to play with Power Rangers and Street Fighter is pretty remarkable. But we saw when we did it, we saw a certain percentage of fans was, as much as they think Street Fighter is cool and as much as they think Power Rangers is cool, they wanted to understand why these two things were coming together, and we didn't do a good enough job telling the story around that. But because it's a game as a service and it's a live game, we were able to very quickly adapt. And within a month, we released a short film that actually told that story and gave fans more of a reason to feel invested in that collaboration and as to why Street Fighter was coming into the world of Power Rangers. So again, I think that to Morgan's point, if you're making a $150 million movie, to some degree, you have to kind of disappear into the kitchen for a couple of years and not necessarily be able to communicate. But if you have a game, you know, that's out in the wild and you're seeing real-time feedback come in, you can make adjustments along the way and really engage with the community in a special way that hopefully becomes productive for both sides.
Yeah, I definitely find in my experiences with this that you have more latitude with some IPs than others. And Star Wars, having worked on it, and I'd love to do another panel where we can all be frank about Star Wars, because I have a ton of thoughts, and I'll take over this whole panel if I let them out. But you know, that's one where you just don't have as much creative freedom from permission from the audience. Where Power Rangers to me is a little bit like Club Penguin, where it's like it's always been an IP that kind of doesn't take itself too seriously. And so, hey, there's Street Fighter guys here. Like, you have to have a reason for it. But the audience, the audience will embrace it more easily because they're not so focused on the canonicity of everything. But I want to turn to Lydia for a second, and get back to this idea of kind of how you build an IP, and talk about Overwatch, because you have Warcraft, you have Diablo, you have StarCraft, you have these long living franchises. But with Overwatch, you were starting from scratch-ish, and your team oversaw the development of the shorts that told the stories of those characters, which were at least I perceived it, a big part of the way the game was rolled out, not just from a marketing standpoint, but from a storytelling standpoint. So talk about how that was different, and what it was like to get to create a new Blizzard IP.
Well, yeah, as you suggest, working with a wide open canvas has really different challenges than being hemmed in by, lore of decades. But for me, that's part of what's exciting about working at Blizzard, is like there's this crazy diversity of not only different types and styles of IP, but also where they are in their lifeline. Probably the thing that I should work in is that I wasn't at Blizzard during the inception of the game. I want to make sure and give like proper credit to the amazing creative duo that is Jeff Kaplan, the game director, and Chris Metzen, who was the creative director at the time, and frankly, sort of the shaman of all worlds and universes of Blizzard, I think, to this day. So those guys really had a vision early on, and when I came in was when the Cinematics campaign was really just getting going and getting started. But those guys had this vision and sort of this grand plan for this very multifaceted IP, that was living in their heads, that they envisioned all of these places they were going to go with it from inception. And it was an interesting and a bit of a new take. It's interesting on Overwatch. I feel like we're always looking forward. We're always worrying about where we're going and how we're going to hem ourselves in, or if we establish something, will we regret that? Will our later selves regret that? With an IP like Diablo or World of Warcraft, it's sort of the opposite. You're always looking backwards, and you're always saying, like, did we violate something? What's the canon of this? Are we getting off track? Are we stepping on some lore from 4 expansions ago? But Overwatch is really fun. It's a really cool open canvas to play with. There's so many different places that we're still getting ready to explore, and places that we're going to be taking both the game and the lore. But again, Jeff Kaplan really had this vision very early on. He speaks about it still many years later. And whenever we're talking about what next cinematic we may be making, or if it could be a lore piece, he always talks about sort of the big vision of the universe he imagined. He was imagining 10 years ago a world with the characters and the different types of linear media that we're exploring now, way back then. So, to some degree, he makes it a lot easier because he's got such a big vision. And, it's fun to get in there and just sort of start laying in all those different pieces and exploring things alongside of that game team. So yeah, we've been talking about the expansion of Overwatch. The next game, Overwatch 2, has been officially announced. We talked about it last year at BlizzCon, that there's going to be one of the new features of the game is going to be something called story missions. And as you can imagine, story missions are going to have components of storytelling that are alongside of the game, which is kind of a new feature. And it's allowing us this kind of whole new exploration and new facet of how we're working with that game. So yeah, it's fun. It's going to be interesting.
Guys, this is what League of Legends is having a hard time with. The fact of the matter is that Overwatch was created with the kind of unifying vision. There were themes, a core communication that was considered during the fabrication of the Overwatch universe. Without that, you would have kind of kitchen sink fantasy, right? All kinds of different components, elements, creatures, magic, science fiction, all bunched together. Without that unifying theme and a kind of long-term plan, backing away from this transmedia canvas and looking at it as an artist, as a true visionary. Without that, you're going to get a kind of patchwork. You're going to get a universe that is difficult to dramatize, and a mashup of artistic styles that don't quite gel. So we're big fans of Overwatch and the approach that was taken by Blizzard.
Yeah, and it's an evolving process. Again, you're never, back to the comment and the dialogue we were having earlier about fans and how they hear you. You know, we try really hard to listen to the community. Jeff Kaplan will say often, you know, this game and the storytelling belongs to the player community now. And there is some truth to that. But obviously we have to still guide it along, and we're still responsible for continuing, you know, to feed content and make sure that the player base is getting, you know, getting their fix of Overwatch, if you will. But again, it was from inception conceived as this very expansive universe. And some of the things we're doing now, 6-7 years later, are things that were already, you know, in the thinking in the early days. And one of our biggest challenges is like, are we going to get enough time and enough opportunity to do everything we want with the game, right? Like, there's so many things that we would like to do with this franchise, and places we would like to take it, and you just, you know, sometimes you worry, can you fit it all in? But I think that's a good problem to have. I'm going to assume that's a good problem to have.
So, Mr. Padour, you have worked with Pokemon for 15 years or so. You worked with them at Jakks Pacific, and they were actually an investor in your toy company, which is very unusual for a games company to have an investment in a toy company. And so you've seen Pokemon go from sort of a, you know, call it B or C tier, you know, smaller IP in the toy space to becoming the biggest piece of intellectual property in the world. Most people don't know this. They think Disney, Star Wars, you know, Marvel, but Pokemon is actually the biggest entertainment IP on the planet Earth. So you've seen that, you've been part of that whole evolution. Can you talk about that and how you have, you know, they have their generations and their themes that they change on a regular basis. Sort of how have you evolved with the franchise?
So, yeah, look, Pokemon has gone from being, they started out a phenomenon, right? And one thing that I think we all know is when you're at that phenomenon status, the one thing that you cannot anniversary is being a phenomenon. But what they did was they course corrected so phenomenally, so wonderfully. They went from being this shock and awe, multi-billion-dollar opportunity right off the bat to settling in the toy space. And when we came in, we recognized right away that the brand was being underdeveloped from a consumer product side. And that was the very first angle and commitment that we made. And my goodness, in the first year that we took over, I think I think we increased sales like 700%. Over the course of the last 15 years, and I think you hit it right on the head, these numbers are plus or minus, but I believe Pokemon in 20-something years has done close to $90 billion in total consumer products revenue. Consumer products, all consumer products, including media. I think Star Wars has done 45 or 50 in 40-something years, to put it in comparison. Yeah, look, they have managed their brand beautifully. They have removed the concerns of seasonality by compressing their generations, the new generations releases with 100 new Pokemon approximately each time. They've supplemented it with things like Go, which turned out to be mind-bogglingly meaningful, and movies and other media. So Pokemon, I think for us, it was just making sure that we recognized that it wasn't a traditional, and forgive me, I'm in the toy space, so they tend to speak in terms of boys and girls properties. Even though it was in the boys aisle, we had to make sure that we didn't see this as a property that was just about conflict. So we have plush and feature plush and electronics and intellectually stimulating toys as well, all within this world in the traditional boys space that is all about conflict play. So I think the one thing that we probably did really the best was evolve what the entire boys aisle is and recognize that it is much more dual gender, and that the play pattern is much more dual gender in a space that tends to be kind of myopic.
Yeah, that's a very important point. It's something I've seen in games, is that gender roles as we think about them in the traditional toy space are just not as applicable, and that a property like Pokemon, girls may gravitate more to the nurture aspect,
Right.
boys may gravitate more to the conflict aspect, but that's not necessarily true, right? I mean, you have girls who are extremely competitive, and so it gets more down to individual motivations as opposed to like these kind of generic industry enforced sort of stereotypical concepts that kind of the mass retail industry has existed on for a long time.
No, there's no doubt. And I think that when you do look at something like Pokemon, what you also see now is that you have the handoff, the multi-generational handoff. And when you have that, then you have massive secondary market value. You have collectible items. You start to take a very different approach to the way that you develop. So today we develop for collectors, we develop for kids, we develop for girls, we develop for boys, and we do it all very respectfully to the brand and the brand beats. And look, when you asked me earlier, how did you go into this gaming space? The other thing I will say is everyone on this call is developing some of the most rich tapestry of entertainment, and that the extension of that is themes and play patterns that are so viable from a toy perspective. So it's been a wonderful thing to be a part of, and it's truly, one of the passions of my life. Very lucky in that regard.
Well, I'm gonna have to leave it there. We are at 11:49, and I promised Ed we get out of here, Ned, we get out of here at 11:50. But I have a feeling we could keep going all day. So, thank you to everyone. This has been a wonderful panel. Love seeing you guys. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you, Chris, Jeremy, Jeff, Morgan, Lydia, Daniel. Fantastic panel. And we're going to move on to another topic that is very exciting. I draft these agendas. It's one of my favorite things to do is kind of create these agendas around topics that I'm interested in. So we're going to now segue into our Power of Influence panel, which is going to focus on the role of streamers, creators, and influencers, and join us in that segment in about 10 minutes. All right. See you guys.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.